yeah. No. Just
We haven't even done any trial runs, or do we even know it's going to work?
um. Do we know it's going to work? As a working man of Manchester, I'd say, given that we made the steam train, the canal, we split the atom. I reckon it's going to work.
Yeah.
Multiple streaming shouldn't be too hard.
Yeah, we can check it's working. Uh,
Do you
so
know if
To whitewash the psyche, you know, to kind of this like utter fantasy of beginning afresh, of being able to like reduce the mind to a blank canvas. And I feel like that, and then because then the rest of the all that stuff you're talking about, like scenes, you know, the obsession with theatre, the sort of mise en scène of of psychiatry, that's all like facilitated and grounded in the fact that this place, the asylum, the psychiatric ward, is like removed from all other forms of reality. So you got later on with George III, you got the matting all around his walls, you know, that doesn't only stop him from harming himself, you know, and doesn't only separate him from the world where he had like sovereign power, but also separates him from any other external reference point, anything outside this new world of the asylum. I thought like that was really interesting as well.
Hmm.
well, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know because there was a slight divergence at the end, but there's a kind of striking divergence in English and German culture, and you see this in Kafka in glimpses as well. And it's the forest in at least 20th, 19th, 18th century Germany is this place of repose and relaxation. Heidegger is often depicted as like walking through a forest or being in a forest. Um, his kind of relationship with the with Nazism and the Hitler Youth is often quite reductively put as that Heidegger shared these same views about connection with nature, about whereas in English culture we very much have this inculcated fear of the forest. The forest is where wolves live. The forest is the teddy bear's picnic. The forest is um, you know said in various ways. Uh, but the
But here, don't you think it's like a sort of like tamed forest? Like the sacred forest is not really a place where you're nourished by nature or where you might encounter wolves. So it's neither of those two forests. It's almost like forest as garden, you know, a manicured forest, a forest in which has been installed as a kind of like background scenery.
well, I don't know. I don't know because Foucault was fluent in German.
Yeah, but
It's a
this is
huge
Pinel
reader
now,
of
isn't it?
like German literature. So this notion of the manicured forest, like it doesn't really exist in English. Yeah. That's the parallel that you're kind of drawing, of this forest and it's sanctity. But maybe if you flip that and think more about the sanctity than the forest, then it being a sacred place. If you kind of put sacred in front of forest and the kind of sanctity and divinity of this forest as um, the kind of driving factor, then I think it does make sense.
Okay. But this Pinel guy, he's French, presumably.
Oh yeah. I mean, everyone
Yeah.
that Foucault reads is French.
Yeah, so I imagine it's just those two words together, sacred forest, written by someone, you know, at the turn of the 19th century. And so, and also someone who's attempting to bring a new kind of rationalism and pragmatism into the world, that then to have that momentary lapse where he's like, okay, well, we're using sacred forest because we realized that we've kind of like fetishized the sacred there. We realized that that's seductive, that gives mystique to this place. We almost like the aesthetics of sacredness because they're good for our purposes. And then you look later on, like it's quite explicit. Look at this kind of a very odd list, phantasmagoria and other resources of physics, music, water, flashes of lightning, thunder, etc., will be used in turn. So what he's imagining is that the psychiatrist has like almost powers over the laws of nature within this place. He has the power to produce like flashes of lightning at will, if that's necessary for the treatment, to produce thunder at will, if that's necessary for the treatment, to devise different forms of music, even devise different laws of physics. The fact that phantasmagoria and physics are put next to one another. Did you see what I'm saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, the point is that's to ensure subservience,
Yeah,
obedience.
exactly. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
That there isn't this
Totalization.
kind of no. I just don't think there's a distinction between the process that you describe and the process that we might, in contemporary terms, describe as treatment.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, yeah.
The, the point that Foucault makes is that these things are coterminous.
Yeah. What do you think, Jakob?
Um, oh, many different things. I think the text is so good, but I didn't read all of it now. Very recently, I read it like the big chunk of the text I read maybe a month ago, so it's not completely fresh to me. But I just think like this way that he, I think this the way he just takes these scenes and the accounts. Like so, where it's his first scene with the asylum, and then there is also this scene with shackles, right? These shackled people who are then. Is this the scene of the cure?
Yeah. Okay.
Or
Yeah,
remind me again.
yeah, because he's comparing two kind of, if you like, almost like primal scenes of psychiatry, like
Right.
mythological moments in psychiatry. One, the kind of popularized one that he's contesting, is this moment where Pinel apparently goes down again, like, I don't know the ins and out details of this, but he goes down into a dungeon where he finds people like, inmates who, some of the mad who have been turned into inmates, basically shackled, kind of
Mm.
bound in the dungeons. And then almost like a kind of miracle worker or like Christ figure takes off their shackles. Now, this act, everyone else had been afraid to do because they felt that afterwards they'd be victims of the madmen's fury and vengefulness after years of being, chained up. But actually, they instantly, show a kind of like gratitude and devotion towards Pinel. So it's this almost like messianic moment, the moment where Pinel inaugurates a new way of dealing with the mad, that's
Yeah.
not involved treating them as criminals, but involves rehabilitation, cure. Foucault then introduces another primal scene, another moment that he thinks kind of like mythologically found psychiatry, and that's the scene with like George III. So
Right.
he's pitting those two moments against each other. And then he does
Yeah,
that.
but
Go on,
I
sorry.
think no, I just think it's an. I mean, without going too much into Foucault, but connecting it to maybe an overall like or also contemporary take on the psychiatric. There is something. I mean, it's a very simple sentence, but somewhere he says that in the scene of confrontation that there is the relationship between the patient and the doctor is a situation of battle, right?
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that there's just something just caught me when I read it, where I was like, this word is just, it's just very simple framing, but where there's just something very interesting, I think, in that. And then, of course, with King George and how that works. But what do you think of that? I found that very interesting, and I I actually also spoke about it with my analyst. Funnily enough, we talked a bit about it, and you know, like, and he was like, because of course the analytic situation is different, but there is also, in a sense, the possibility of having a battle in analysis, but it's although there is also a completely different kind of mode, you know, or yeah, which I thought was interesting, you know, to think
Well,
about that. And then he deploys all these military like words like a strategy and tactics and these things. I don't know, it's interesting. I'm just thinking about like what yeah, what you think about that, or what both of you kind of figure in relation to that.
Yeah.
but what's this? What's this? You know, in the kind of depravity of contemporary psychiatry, right? Um, we're very far away from even what Foucault depicts as depravity might now be depicted as some kind of idealism, right? Like there's this kind of beautiful crystalline confrontation between the physician and the person who's mad. Um, I found something that was interesting was when he said that madness was it was to do with action or believing or behaving in the right or correct way,
Mm.
um, which is kind of obviously the case. Like in psychiatric hospitals, and this was noted in, I mean, from the 50s or 60s in England, most people in psychiatric hospitals, the majority of people, they didn't have a disorder or a disturbance that was, so severe you could classify it as a disorder.
Mm.
They just had, problems with day-to-day living or, many things. Um, but they were essentially kind of living up to the rigors of, and demands of an industrial society. Um, but this notion of confrontation strikes me because I think that psychiatry has lost that. You know that I mean I'm speaking specifically here of Britain and France. I'm not sure about Denmark.
Mm.
Um, and also, I'm not speaking from the experience of someone with a disorder like schizophrenia. Um,
Yeah,
but
that is
this
interesting.
this 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 notion of the confrontation being based on a kind of imposition of a certain reality,
Mm.
um, I think is kind of it's almost outmoded as psychiatric practice has moved from the very notion of cure to a notion of management. So like a psychiatric nurse said to me recently, I was speaking to him, he was like, and I was talking about paranoid schizophrenia, and he was like, oh, but we know how to manage this now. So,
Mm.
so rather than there being any, which at the time there was still this kind of notion of cure, in the 70s and the 80s. Now, and you see this across all, um, psychiatric disorders like um, even very loose ones like autism, ADHD, whatever. It isn't about solving or getting to the root of or curing the ailment or the disturbance. It's
Mm.
rather just about finding activities in day-to-day life that enable one to live. So there's been an important shift, I think, from when Foucault was giving these lectures in the 70s to now, which is something I'm sure we'll come back to at a later time. But there's been an important shift from cure to management. And I think most psychiatry today, and most popular thought today, is dependent upon this notion of management
That's
and
interesting.
kind of like integration.
So you're saying there's almost like a kind of lost, like in the scenes depicted by Pinnell, there's a kind of almost like romanticism or sublimity into psychiatry, which we've lost now, because at the very least, even though the psychiatrist used these kind of like devious tactics, even though he saw his relationship to this whatever the insurrectionary force of madness as that of like a lion tamer, someone who needed to, how should I put it, like sort of dodge and dive like a kind of boxer or a dancer to eventually come bring the madman back under control. Right? At the very least, he came face to face with the elemental force of madness, with madness as kind of like raw vitality. Whereas now, you know, there are no well, you don't meet a psychiatrist really. You meet someone who's been like delegated to temporarily stand as understudy, as replacement for the psychiatrist, and who has been given a sort of like user manual, set of instructions, a sort of code of conduct, which he then applies to you, to help you become the manager of your own disorder. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, because like you're right. Some like what I found really interesting about that, kind of like to bring together the two things you said about, yeah, what Luke is saying, and then Jack and Jacob's kind of like worry or meditation on this, or joy of this metaphor of the battleground, is that, let's say, like, how should I put it? Let's say in that moment where George the Third, yeah, he's been restrained in this room, and there's a kind of like a way of taking back revenge, taking revenge, a way of like kind of like reacquiring sovereignty by deploying it in this inverted form and chucking excrement at the who is it, at the doctor he chucks excrement. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It's the attendants. The
Okay, he chucks it.
Herculean, the Herculean attendants.
Does he? Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right. I thought they were the ones that come in and take him afterwards, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. At least there.
No. It's I don't know the significance of it, but it's something that Foucault comes back to 2 or 3 times, which is that the doctor never appears.
Yeah, although they say that a substitute doctor appears, some other old doctor.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
the doctor in question never appears.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's the old doctor that gets the shit.
Yeah.
Or actually, but I think we should leave that scene till later. But you know that one where he's basically Pinel is kind of writing an instruction manual for future pages, and he says like if the mad person needs to be brought under restraint, there's a certain way that you should look at him. Okay, you should kind of like fix him with an intimidating or imperious stare. Okay, so that you kind of lock eyes with the madman, and in doing so, produce blind spots in his peripheries, so that secretly, and kind of silently, 2 other assistants can tiptoe around the back of him and seize him before he has a chance to realize what's going on. So you have this
Yeah.
idea that this whatever psychiatry manual reads like a kind of art of war, where you have to use tactics of deception, underhandedness,
Yeah, and he uses the word flank,
decoys,
outflank.
outflank. Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of hilarious. So although again, so to go back to Jacob's point, that does depict, the scene of psychiatry as a battleground. Nonetheless, you have to actually be there in front of someone who shows enough, in the way of being, dangerous or volatile or, vociferous, such that, I don't know, you kind of like, you see the human in its raw form, you see like the beast kind of undulating through the man. And that in itself is an experience that like the whole of modern medicine or modern psychiatry, or in its soft form as psychology, kind of withdraws from, has abandoned. So is that what you're kind of saying, Luke?
Right,
No.
can I come in here?
No.
Yeah. What?
No. That's what you're saying, but I was listening.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's the sort of territory you're trying to cover with that statement about modern psychiatry or modern psychology.
No. I mean, it was quite a flippant observation, to be honest.
Okay, all right, all right.
Though I do find this movement from pure to management, and I'd be interested to look at some ancient texts, uh, and see, because pure has this kind of particular sense to it. Anyway, and the way in which it's deployed. Jakob, you had something to say.
No, no, we're just interested in that, like in the sense of I'm just intrigued, like when we make the reason why I find the battleground analogy interesting is because exactly, I think because of the reason you were saying, but we have this kind of neoliberal management shit going on instead, now. But the interesting thing is, I think, as well as with the thoughts of Foucault, like so many people now, we have for also this, for example, Byung-Chul Han, who argues with Foucault and says, well, no, disciplinary society is over. Now we have the achievement society or some shit like this, right? And I think it's a bit stupid because it simply says then that multiple things cannot be operating at the same time, right? Or that remnants of an old system cannot kind of be
Yeah,
integrated into
yeah.
a newer one, and yeah, etc., etc., right? So I think the interesting thing is to, yeah, I don't know. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I'm curious to understand in most cases how does that battle look today? Because what he depicts is like a very kind of certain battles in that takes a certain shape, right? And now today we have there's a different kind of battle in a sense, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose
Like people beg to get diagnosis, they beg their psychiatrist for diagnosis, and then their psychiatrist like, no, I'm not going to give you a diagnosis, but they're like, yeah, no, give me ADHD, give me autism, or whatever, like that. I mean, I'm making a bit of a,
Yeah, no, no, no.
yeah,
I think though that's precisely the Foucauldian move, right?
yeah,
So if you there's some very interesting work in the mid 20th century on homosexuality, and it's a really simple example. You take the notion of homosexuality is something that you're born with, right? Um, which to me is both a nonsense and it's very restrictive and limiting. We should be able to love and fuck who we want without containing it within some stupid cage. Um, maybe I'm fucking guys from Monday to Friday and women from Saturday to Sunday. I don't know. There are like a million combinations of sexuality one could imagine. Um, but I think that if you look at that belief that homosexuality is something you're born with, it's precisely an example of what Foucault calls the reversibility of power. Now, the misreading of Foucault, like of a lot of his work, comes from these kind of he introduces in this lecture series the microphysics of power. Now that's been misunderstood and misinterpreted as microaggressions, right? The reason why we
mm,
have the notion of microaggressions is from a misinterpretation of Foucault. Uh, Similarly, um, the notion of reversibility of power is very important. So when people generally consider the notion of the reversibility of power, they think, oh, we can always switch it, we can always flip it, we can always do da da da. Whereas what he's actually saying is that within and in and of itself, that power is always reversible. So to take it from the kind of the kind of stance that you were talking about, homosexuality. Oh well, we're born this way, right? Now, of course, in the context of puritanicalism and a Christian sense of guilt, morality, culpability, which is ultimately based on intent, by saying that I was born this way, well, that frees you from that moral nexus, right? You no longer become culpable or responsible. I cannot
mm,
help my homosexuality because I was born in this way. But then the problem is, and I think this is something really essential about Foucault that comes out time and time again, is that this hardens into a notion that you are only homosexual if you are born as homosexual. That precisely the kind of heterotopia and fluidity that Foucault imagined in terms of genders and all that is eliminated and gotten rid of, and then a kind of like a hierarchy of birth like that of kings is established, where I was born homosexual, and then I became homosexual, and then you have one superior to the other. At the same time, I think that a lot of the contemporary misunderstandings and confusions about gender and that arguments in and between these kinds of groups of people stem from that kind of misunderstanding. Um, and I think it's something that I've not resolved, or I always
Wait,
sort
can you
of
clarify the
propose.
misunderstanding?
You are?
Like, what's the misunderstanding? Can you clarify? Or
Well,
how do you see it?
What they don't get is that by introducing this notion that, okay, if you're born gay, then you're gay. For example,
Mm.
if you're born homosexual, you're homosexual. Power is reversible in both ways. So, at a particular moment of time, a particular moment in history, that allowed um, homosexuals, which again is a kind of arbitrary category, but let's say that men who wanted to have sex with men sometimes,
Mm.
um, it allowed them to free themselves from a particular form of objection, subjection, persecution, but at the same time, it encages and enwraps them in this notion of biological determinism. In what in the long view, eugenics, and then later on, the maintenance of that view, kind of hardened and crystallized, then poses loads of problems for the articulation of a new form of sexuality, in which fluidity and choice are the kind of watchwords. Or, what governs, like the contemporary scene of sexuality, right, is one where it's all about choice, where it's all
Mm.
about fluidity. So this notion of being born, gay, as in homosexual, at one point served a very important function to free people from a certain kind of culpability, and therefore from a certain kind of repression or oppression. However, that ceases to be tactically useful when the conditions of terrain uh, are changed, in which choice and voluntarism become predominant. And
Right.
so that's where, to link it back to the reversibility of power, I think that the link to the reversibility of power is that it's reversed in both ways. So to take that example, is that it's not just the kind of Foucauldian liberatory sense in which, for every power there is a counter power. It's also that in deploying these tactics of power, now, well, it can be reversed back again. So if you think originally, what was it that oppressed, suppressed, contained, whatever, homosexuality? Well, it was Christianity, right? And it was this. And then in Christianity, one cannot be culpable or cannot be responsible for things that are not with intent, that are not chosen, right? So you have this
Mm.
notion of choice that's central to Christianity. So you subvert that by saying, well, actually, I was born in this way, right? It was God's decision. It was God's choice that I was born in this way. So
Mm.
how dare you? How dare you, oppress me? How dare you find me revolting or disgusting because God said that I should be in this way? But then once the kind of background of, because we're talking about the 30s to the 80s here, roughly. Once that background of kind of Christian Puritanism has like died down or become diffused to the extent that it has today, and things move to voluntarism and fluidity, then all of a sudden, that power that is crystallized and hardened can be reversed back. And it can be said, well, you can't be fluid in your gender, you can't be, fluid in your sexuality, because you're either born gay or you're not gay. Which are you? So that's a point often remarked upon. is that the reversibility of power works in both ways. But I think the broader point, which is important to Foucault in general, is that the adoption of a anachronistic, historical, situated, tactical maneuver, which to bring this vocabulary of the battle back in, becomes
Yeah, nice one.
hardened and crystallized. And then later on, it poses problems as the conditions of the world change.
Mm.
But well, both of you, like, then, because when he says this, like, there's just something. I mean, as someone who's not read him so much, I was like, oh fucking hell! Now there comes this like vocabulary that I feel feels very Foucauldian when he starts to talk about strategy and tactics and these kind of things, where he sort of says that, what is it that he says, that the does he says socio-psychological, what is the word that he uses, where which he says, I'm not going to speak
Psychosociological,
in
yeah.
this. Yeah, psychosociological, where he says, well, I'm not going to speak in this language, because I will now, use this new language, kind of.
Yeah,
What,
yeah, yeah.
like, what does it signify to you?
But I think one of the things, like Luke mentioned earlier on, was this idea that Foucault performs a kind of series of reversals and rereadings of himself, especially in that second lecture, where he rejects some of his old conclusions about, like, made in Histoire de la Folie, and one of the ones he rejects, like, interestingly, is the idea that the institution, it should be like a sort of privileged object of study. And that fits in here because basically he's saying that if the institution is a privileged object of study, then the thing that we should be looking at are its codes, its regulations, its practices, its policies, and so on. And we look at them, as if they were fundamental. Now that's precisely what we shouldn't be doing, because there's that if you like, that's the game of truth. The game of truth is, how do I inscribe what's going on into a kind of like system of values, or into a system of scores or measurements or whatever it is. Now, what Foucault says, there's a game of power that precedes this game of truth. Okay. And so that's why he wants to replace, like, the institution as an privileged object of study with this thing that Luke was going on about, the micro physics of power. And the micro physics of power are precisely everything that goes on in that arena of confrontation between the psychiatrist and, all his, his whole retinue, and, list of secondary actors, and the madman himself. Okay. And it's a confrontation. But so, and later on, like, let's say, when the psychiatrist has sort of developed a series of techniques and strategies and tactics that work, they then become built up into an institution. Okay. They then become almost like written out as regulations, codes of conduct, policies, recommended strategies. But that's a later stage. Okay. So the institution then is not primary. So, like, that's why I think that, like, that's why he studies, for example, you've got King George throwing shit at you, yeah. Well, there's in like, the potential responses to what King George is doing, you don't have any talk between the psychiatrist and King George, any attempt to bring King George, like, into cognizance or understanding of the truth of his situation. No, you have like a direct battle between the kind of the I don't know, the violence or the vitality of his madness and the need to calm that madness, to bring it back to a kind of a state of balance or equipoise, or to kind of like neutralize that madness. And that's the only aim. Right? That's like the sort of first step of cure, the neutralization of that raw elemental force of madness. And then you get this idea that, okay, well, what does the page do? The Herculean pages, they come in, they grab his belt, They then this practice, they scrub him, So they get rid of the shit. They bring him back to a state of plainness, or they take away the marks that he's kind of like inscribed in his body, these marks of rebellion or whatever it is, the shit that's all over him. And there's another really nice moment where, as soon as the page does that, he looks at him haughtily. Okay. So again, he's debasing, humiliating, belittling the king. So that's another practice that might get inscribed as a principle in an institution. Okay, you must humiliate, you must profane the king, you must belittle him. And then the Herculean page is described as going immediately to his post. Okay, so you might think of that as another like thing that will later develop into an institutional policy. Don't have any personal contact with the king. Don't be a human. Okay, seem to be absolutely one with your function. You know, flesh to your function. Nothing more than this page who sweeps in at the opportune moment, scrubs the king, gives him a haughty look, and then goes back to his post again. You know. But the point is that we've described those things before they get formulated as laws, before they get formulated as principles. Anyway, that's my understanding of this idea that the game of power precedes the game of truth.
I think the something interesting about that is that I don't know whether it's the audio or whether there was a slippage, but this like I kept hearing kid, not king, and well, what I kind of thought
That is funny,
was
yeah.
that there was a no, that there's a displacement, right? Because that might have been a psychiatric scene, and now is completely inapplicable to contemporary psychiatry. And, we'll see how he goes with it, but that psychiatric scene could very easily be transposable onto the school.
Definitely, yeah, yeah.
You know
Yeah,
that the contemporary school, all of the formal maneuvers that Foucault makes there are absolutely characteristic of the contemporary school. So whether it's and if you take like the best schools like Eton, Harrow, the buildings, the pillars, the kind of sense of grandeur and imposition, like Oxford, um, and then the yeah, and then the way that the school is precisely about. I mean, we've had long discussions about this, but there are elements of the curricula that are just nonsense. They don't make any sense whatsoever.
yeah,
But one's only possibility of achieving that, stamp of success from the institution of the school is to repeat back, nonsensical, completely arbitrary taxonomies. I'm talking about like writing to persuade, writing to describe, all that
yeah,
nonsense.
yeah, yeah.
And it's funny that this great moment of confrontation that Foucault locates in psychiatry is actually the kind of great moment of confrontation of the contemporary school.
Yeah, I just kept thinking of those parallels again and again, because
You know,
at some level, the school just does exist to sort of contain, neutralize, and tame the enormous like exuberance, lust for life, riotousness, and like weirdness of kids, you know. So like to go back to another example that like we often riff on, there are loads of things that pose as moments of education, okay, within school systems that are really in fact like elements of military discipline. So you get into a classroom and there's a moment where you almost have to do like a kind of genuflection and obsequy before not the teacher but before learning itself by writing out the date, and underlining it, and doing this thing called like the do now, which is basically a way of getting kids to answer really banal, kind of one-dimensional, simple-minded questions, but it gets them writing on a page. It gets them into this kind of like mood where they're happy to be sedentary, where they're happy to literally a work on the body itself, where the bodies are tucked behind desks, where they're not talking to their friends, So it looks like they're doing this recall exercise, but it's so like mind-bustingly easy, and pointless and empty that really it's quite patently to anyone outside observer like who's like a little bit read, in any kind of like social science, it seems instantly like a disciplinary maneuver. And what you realize as you go through the lesson is the whole thing is nothing but disciplinary maneuvers. So you're studying English literature, and every second you're answering like a question that requires a one-line answer. So it's like a constant attempt to like capture the distractedness of the student, to snap him out of this moment where he might like start talking to a friend or make a joke across the classroom or something. And that's even before we get to the next level of discipline, which is also very, very strict. Um, and like the big effect that I noticed when I went into Harris Academy is that instead of what you would expect, boisterousness in the classroom, vitality in the classroom, anarchy in the classroom, you get like sedation, a sense of like supreme exhaustion and acrasia in the classroom, a willlessness and apathy. So people literally like this, like their hands are kind of going on autopilot and they're just not there, They're, and like utter somnolence.
Well,
And
I mean
Well, I'll take some tea in a sec. Okay.
the transposability is kind of is part of what Foucault is trying to do.
yeah, no
Move us
doubt.
away
Yeah.
to well, I mean, like a strange ontological status that I mean he definitely couldn't define, and if we get there, that'd be quite an achievement.
Mm.
But that transposability is quite interesting. How I was also thinking of the servant. Um, the when he's talking about this kind of microphysics of power, and he talks about the servant and how the servant performs this kind of weird inversion that precisely by being someone who like normally obeys, right? So the servant washes him, the servant gets him clothes, the servant brings him food. The servant is at the same time the one who refuses, the one who says no. Now's not the time for food, and the servant loops back into the kind of overarching loop of power, which I think is the fundamental misunderstanding about Foucault micro power and the microphysics of power. It's that he isn't talking about I don't know like microaggressions as they're understood in the kind of contemporary zeitgeist. He's talking about the way in which, without the compliance, obedience, and subordination of each kind of level or strata of power, all the way down to the servant. Like Oxford, they have these people, and their name is very revealing. They're called scouts. And basically, the scout comes in, they clean your room, they like empty your bins and da, da, da. But then they're also like spies. So if you like start drinking quite a lot, they'll notify the disciplinary committee. If your eating habits change, if your social life changes such that you're not there for a few days or you are there for a few days, all of these things get like fed back into the kind of regime of power, and it always makes me laugh that people don't get it. It's like the clue is in the name. They are called scouts.
But it's funny because actually it works on two levels. Like it hits two registers. Because I don't know, Jakob, do you have scouts? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, all right. So on the one hand, it's like the spy, the one who like scouts out terrain, the one who looks, and that links to like Foucault's description of the servants as the ocular canals, of the doctor. And then, but secondly, you got the scouts, like the little boys who get badges for doing like good work. So they're both like the goody goody, the kind of teacher's pet, and also the spy, the authority undercover.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, Luke. Yeah, I just thought.
No,
So they win a kind of badge of honor, by grassing on you, by snitching on you.
Hmm.
Just to pick up on another thing. So Luke, you were talking about the servants and like in that scene as well, like what the servants do. You're right. They had this kind of like Janus faced. They had this kind of like built-in duplicity. So like they used to be, so they seem to be the lowliest, the most humble, and so on. But they also provide the first check, the first no, as you put it. but always by invoking the doctor, by invoking the authority of the doctor. So they're also like this medium by which the sort of omnipresence or ubiquity of this mysterious figure, the doctor, is ensured, guaranteed. So that he seems to be like the sort of I don't know what to say about that, but he seems to be he's both withdrawn and therefore kind of non-existent, but he seems to be the god in this place. Yeah.
Mm.
And I thought that was quite funny as well. Um, Also, yeah, another thing just about that reversibility of power, okay? Because I actually think there's a kind of like hilarious, comical, basically Kafkaesque example of that reversibility of power in Foucault's analysis. Do you remember that moment where he goes on like a little digression and excursus, and he starts talking about uh, pictures of the king, that somehow exemplify the king's authority, the king's like sovereignty and symbolic power. And he talks about like three stages. So at the first stage, you have the king who manifests a kind of physical power in and through being a sort of king warrior, right? A Herculean king. And he says
Mm.
there you have him, and he's like massive, and he's wearing his breastplate, and he's armed and so on. And then you've got like a second stage, and this second stage is like the Kafkian, like the Kafkaesque stage, where the king has, and you can understand how this works. The king has liberated himself from bodily power, because bodily power is a burden. You have to go and fight in the wars, leisure and otium and like surplus time. They're the kind of luxuries in life. That's the real sovereignty. So if a king is actually having to go out and fight his own battles, in some way that demeans him. That kind of sullies him. So what he does is he delegates the responsibility of physical power to subordinates. Okay, and then you get the first manifestation of the Herculean page. All right, and in that moment there, Foucault almost imagines the Herculean page. You imagine it, so there's the king here, and the king has got his crown, he's got his scepter, and perhaps now he's reading a Bible because he's more learned and erudite, and he's the kind of wise king, the scholar king. And then he's got the Herculean pages ready to fight his battles for him. But then, of course, Foucault imagines these Herculean pages almost with a kind of ironic twinkle in their eyes, because they realize that by having inherited the king's brute force, his physical power, his military prowess, they are somehow quite close to completely usurping his authority. And of course, the third stage is where they do usurp his authority. They become, you know, hospital porters or, assistants in a psychiatric department working for the psychiatric power against the king,
Mm.
working to strip him of sovereignty. And I thought that kind of like three stages there struck me like was a good example of what Luke was calling the reversibility of power, because you've got this moment where the king gives up his physical prowess because that gives him more power, that gives him more leisure time, time to study, to cultivate his mind and so on. So tactically, it seems good to him at that moment in time. But then later on, at the third stage, it becomes very bad for him because it means that he's enormously dependent on these pages, these Herculean pages that can be turned, reversed, seduced by a different form of power, a power that can be leveraged now against the king in the form of psychiatry.
Mm.
So I thought, like, I don't know, you can just, Luke, you were kind of riffing on the reversibility of power, but actually you can locate it, the analysis of this reversibility of power in the text itself as well. He's already talking about it.
I think there's something interesting here that will come later, but he's Foucault's beginning to investigate a certain displacement, right, which will be 3 or 4 lecture series from now. But he's beginning to investigate a certain displacement in which what you might call juridical or legal power becomes subject to, not just subject to, in fact, it's in an important sense constituted by psychiatric power. So what I mean by that is that the kind of ideal juridical subject, who is free of will, conscious of mind, has to be established. And that establishment is based on, and this is like another kind of broad thing about Foucault, is that it actually comes from Levi-Strauss, which is that we can understand the society not best by what that society tries to include, by what that society extols as its virtues, but by what it tries to get rid of, by what it considers to be dirt or trash, or which is like a huge theme in anthropology. And yeah, in order to institute this kind of Christian subject of law, which is the burden and baggage of which we still suffer. Recently there's been this huge hoo-ha about I don't know if it's a white paper or a green paper that's to do with sentencing and sentencing reform, and it basically instructs judges to take into account certain characteristics, race, ethnicity, sexuality. The debate in the mainstream media tends to take the form of, well, this is unfair, this is but the actual groups at which the legislation are targeted have been historically overpunished. So like if you're a person who will be marked down as black, you are likely to get a longer sentence for the same crime. So both in an attempt to assuage a kind of historical injustice and also to reduce, just the kind of banality of prisons being full. So the point is that this baggage of the universal subject of law has been with us for quite a while, and that universal subject of law is based first and foremost on an act of exclusion, on an act of negativity or refusal, which is the mad. So, in a very important sense, law comes into being and comes to kind of dominate, in the sense we know it today, in its kind of, impersonal, rational, with checks and balances and all this kind of crap. It comes into being precisely with an act of exclusion, which is the mad. And that's why we see the legal and judicial system that we have and know now kind of take shape around and have its formation within the context of madness and insanity. And that'll that's something that'll become clearer in later lectures to read.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, that is interesting actually. And I think it's also like, I remember there's one moment, like Foucault does a few little maneuvers that he doesn't really sort of like pick up on later on or recuperate. But there's one time that I thought like was really like nice where he says, something like, "What is it to be mad?" Well, to be mad seems always to involve thinking of yourself as king. Okay, so it seems always to involve thinking of yourself as superior to everybody else. Now I thought like this is why I made like such a hoo-ha and like big deal about this separation of the asylum from the rest of reality earlier, because I can imagine some like sort of commonsensical, like scientific, pragmatical thinker coming along and being like, well, of course, to think you're like to put yourself above everybody else, to believe that you're king, to think of yourself as exceptional and as exempt from the laws of society is to be dangerous. So this person must be considered mad and then reinitiated back into society again. Now, and so what I thought was actually, well, no, because the asylum the asylum cuts us off from reality. And so when the asylum becomes this kind of phantasmagoric place, okay, what happens, it's almost like there's what we're experiencing here is a kind of the dream sequence of the psychiatrist. Okay. So who is the psychiatrist at this moment in human history? The psychiatrist is someone, like, again, Foucault kind of mentions this, who wants to behead the king. Okay, he wants to kill the king. He takes as his enemy all forms of superiority, sublimity, things that escape the common, things that escape the norm. And so it's kind of fitting that someone like Pinel wants to turn psychiatry into an act of deposition, dethroning. And you can imagine that taking a whole variety of forms. The literal form of, like, dethroning and stripping King George of his signs of sovereignty. But if you take sovereignty in that kind of grander sense, sovereignty like in Bataille's work, as including basically anything which involves a kind of royalty of existence. So it could be a moment of, like, jouissance in poetry, yeah, or it could be that period when you finished work, and you go out on the adventure of a Friday night, and you don't know what's going to happen next, and you kind of like gamble yourself on, some absolute change and break with your old life. That's another moment of sovereignty. So leisure itself is a kind of sovereignty. So what the psychiatrist becomes an enemy of is all forms of sovereignty. And psychiatry, again, I don't know, like, I'm kind of like, this is kind of getting away from me a little bit, but the scene of instruction, the scene of what the psychiatrist calls cure, is really and fundamentally a kind of an act of envy, okay, an act of, like, resentment, a desire to strip sovereignty from human beings.
What would because, like, all of the things that you were just saying, my mind just went Scandinavia. Um, like the kind of substance of what Patrick was saying. Like, Jakob seems to me almost kind of governing characteristics of Scandinavian society. Like the Jantelov and this sense of, like, not thinking that you're above anyone else. And then even the kind of immediately when he was talking about the various mechanisms, I was thinking about being in a bodega in Copenhagen and reading a book, and this posing this, like, massive problem to people. Um, and I was just wondering from, like, two perspectives. One, just that there's a certain substitution in what Patrick was saying between or an overlay between the psychiatrist and the demands of society, right? In which the psychiatrist becomes a kind of operator or relay, if you want to use Foucault's words for, and I have therapy, and I've spoken to my therapist about this, and about different kinds of normativity, and it's quite good because he's a therapist who's worked with refugees, and he's traveled and he speaks multiple languages, so he's very aware of normativity. But then what then, so there's the two bits that are interesting, I think, is, like, if the psychiatrist here functions as a kind of substitute for societal demands, what does that mean in a Scandinavian context? And then secondly, the more kind of, like, explicit question would be, what then is a Scandinavian psychiatrist, normatively speaking? Are they simply, and this is something, like I said, that I've had a big problem with for a long time, are they simply someone who just imposes the social normativity upon you, or are those things completely unrelated?
I mean, yeah, I'm just going to say two things just as a kind of bookmark so we can return to. But I think what's interesting, I was thinking when you were saying this, Patrick, and some previous stuff that you were saying, Luke, that I mean, with this thing with the sovereign, or like, or the kind of the power that the psychiatrist seems to hold, in a sense, is interesting because I can't remember what he does in the text, and this seems crucial. So I mean, it would be nice to return to that. But when we're talking now, I'm like, yeah, but like what about the material infrastructure here? What about the kind of, in a sense, ideological infrastructure, like the diagnosis, the prescriptions, the pharma, like all these things that kind of in today would be restricting and informing and kind of in a way also disciplining the psychiatrist, like the DSM, for example, like um and also in what schools the psychiatrist, kind of goes into and where they can find work and funding and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's just something to return to, maybe. But I don't know. I think it's a bit different. I mean, my understanding is that I can't say. To be honest, I can't say. I mean, what seems like it's been happening is that you have like a very bio-based paradigm, just overall, and that's very fairly simple. We know this, right? Um, but I'm not so like. I mean, Scandinavia now is a kind of neoliberal society, right? Before it was way more kind of. I mean, it is neoliberal, but with the kind of Yantelo um, spice or whatever. I don't know, like, but yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe in Scandinavia you have that, but it also makes me. What it makes me think about is that okay, but the disobedience in a way, or like, or the in a sense the sovereignty of oneself. I mean, it makes me think of this kind of discussion in this Wengro and Graeber book, where the kind of the Jesuits are like very upset, when they go to the Wendats, because the Wendats, they just mock their leaders, and the Jesuits are like, like what the fuck is this thing? You treat your leaders with no authority. What is this thing? And that's interesting, because I don't think that's a Scandinavian thing, but what they share is, of course, a kind of, no one should stick out, kind of, in a sense, right? No one should hold this power. But I think in Scandinavia, there is a kind of authoritarian figure in a different way. I would be curious to investigate this, but I mean, a lot of this Jantelone thing in Scandinavia, this kind of very, the base of the social control, in my understanding, comes from these small, often rural villages where you would have one industry, and then all these people kind of very dependent on this industry, and then you would have maybe a few people or one person that would, control the village, and then in that situation, this very kind of, like, yeah, it became very important not to stick out. Everyone had to adapt and make sure this thing worked, and it's called, in Swedish, it's called uh, yeah, I can't really translate it, but it would be called something like um, I don't know what it's called, like it's called a spirit, but I don't know if it's a spirit of a factory or if it's a spirit of a kind of site of production. I don't know what you call that in English, but it's the spirit of a site of production.
What
Like it could
what's
be a
the
mill
what,
or
what's the Swedish word?
bruksanda. Bruk means to use. Like it can both mean a kind of site of production, or it can mean usage of something. So this is a kind of, this is the, I mean, Jantelon is a fictional thing, right? But this would be the kind of the real thing, the historical thing.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, it interested me now, having lived in Denmark, um, and knowing my fair bunch of Swedes and Finns and Norwegians, as you get to do when you hang around a lot. Because Patrick, if you've never lived in Denmark, don't. If you do, you'll find that all your mates are Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian, or from somewhere else. Ireland, English. You'll make any Danish mate. Um, but there's something interesting to me, because you have this, like, I always say that Denmark have the best PR in the world as a nation. Like there is no nation that presents itself as well as Denmark. Like we're the
The
world's
US,
happiest
maybe.
nation, like all this bollocks, and it's miserable and it's depressing. And un- unless you submit to Danish society, entirely, and that's a very difficult thing to do, like as an individual, even if you kind of follow the rituals and go to the events and jump off a chair at fucking New Year or whatever. Like it's still like quite a difficult thing, to kind of integrate oneself. Um, and it's at the same time the nation with the highest level per capita of prescribed antidepressants. Right, so that's fucked up. You have a nation that ostensibly is the happiest in the world, and a nation that has the highest level of prescribed antidepressants. Now, I'm not going to be a you know marketer for Pfizer, but either Pfizer is doing some really good shit, and we should all be dropping down the Xanax, or there's something fucked up going on there. Um, and then I think also something interesting is this notion of the master. So that's where, do you know that Jacques Lacan, the video where the student like intervenes, and Lacan like ends up like agreeing with him, but he points out, he's like, well, in this student's discourse, which was kind of right, and like I don't have any problem with his intervention. There's this missing figure of the master. Who is the master? And it kind
Mm.
of there, it takes this like ghoulish form, like an apparition. Like where is it? Does it exist or does it not? And it's funny because in Scandinavia, at least in my experience, there's almost a similar thing, and it really does a link with like Foucault's notions of like micro power, capillary power, because there isn't an obvious master. You know? It isn't. I don't know. Like being in the UK, it seems, although misguided, it's very obvious who we're governed by and what rules us. Whereas in Denmark, the the way that people behave is, I mean, if I was to take a case study of Foucault's notion of power, which we will come to later because this lecture series is when he's just beginning to consider it. And I think two lecture series after is when he really, develops his notion of power. Like Denmark will be the perfect one because it is precisely through these like micro interactions, like
Mm.
and then do you remember you told me about that cunt at Temple Bar who like grabbed your cigarette out of your hand or something?
Yeah.
And then that's something also interesting is that because or like you could use the example of me reading a book. It's like the forms of imposition, let's say, or expectation, or expectation then being imposed upon you are like either very light and kind of like cumulative. They're expressed in like a sigh or a glance or a minor exclusion from a group, or they're very extreme. They're very like rah. It's like the Danes, they have like two modes, like 20 miles an hour and 100 in
Mm.
terms of like expressing grievance.
Mm.
This to me seems interesting. I mean, very practically in relation to the kind of psychiatric, like let's the asylum or the psychiatric situation in a way, because I think that I mean mustn't that kind of rely upon a certain atomized existence or a certain way in which it doesn't seem to be a mass. It's a mass of nodes. Like there is not just a mass that is kind of, you know, because there is something about that I think in Scandinavia. I mean, the reason why you have a kind of egalitarian um, system in a sense, but also this like very I don't know if it's just an obedience to codes or that it's a sense of social control. like how is it that these things can kind of, so we have consensus, the principles of like of still a very high level of unionization. All these things I think are still like collective bargaining, these kind of things. So there is a sense of collectivity and union and consensus, but then at the same time there is a kind of strange social culture where where people are kind of atomized. They're a little bit awkward. The bad silence is a kind of Swedish thing. The Swedes, they kind of they're almost proud to endure the bad silence. Kind of, it's a funny thing, but
So
the day.
sorry, what's bad silence?
Or it's like the awkward silence, like when there's like the Swedes, they're kind of producers of awkward silence. When no one really knows what to say, and then it's kind of, oh, did I say something wrong? Oh no, did you say something wrong? Or like just that thought or those thoughts actually are kind of representative for the whole situation, right? Did I say something wrong? Did you say something wrong? Probably maybe we both said something wrong, But then, yeah, who is the master in that situation? I don't know, But um, yeah. But I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
just thinking
interesting.
about it in relation to psychiatry. Maybe it's to tie it back so we don't spend our time talking about Denmark. I don't know.
I suppose maybe just tie back to like that distinction that Foucault makes between sovereign power and like disciplinary power. I just don't think that like that's best understood in terms of like, on the one hand, the sovereign power is like the king, and the disciplinary power is whatever it is, those set of maneuvers, policies inscribed in an institution or something, But
Mm,
he kind of like defines it in two ways, which I think link to what we're saying here. On the one hand, the sovereign power is concentrated. It's concentrated visibly and spectacularly in a single individual. Okay,
mm,
so it's like a power that's kind of manifest on show, that kind of flaunts itself, parades itself. Okay, and I think like in that sense actually escapes the system, right? Under which it lives. So the king is always in excess of the society over which he's king. You know, the paraphernalia and regalia of kinship somehow don't quite fit into that world. They're an expression of that excess. Again, like Bataille says, the akasha, an expression of that surplus, the thing that's not reducible to the norms, principles, and inner workings of that society. Anyway, and then I guess on the other level, the disciplinary power is in comparison to that discrete, insidious, almost invisible. Okay.
mm,
Secondly, the sovereign power is one that's like, how should I put it? It it affirms itself in the individual who's supposed to have power, i.e., the king. The king is the person in whom you see the sovereign power manifest itself. Whereas the disciplinary power is precisely not manifested in the person who seems to have power. It's visible only in the person who's subject to that power, the person who's the victim of that power,
right.
the first person who's like, been been disciplined by that power or neutralized by it or tamed or contained by it. So like, you can distinguish the sovereign power from the disciplinary power in those like two like more conceptual ways, right? On the one hand, it's manifest, visible, spectacular in a way that kind of escapes the system of which it's over which it reigns. On the other hand, there's this distinction between, is the power manifest in the person that has power, or is it only visible or discernible in the person who's the victim of power?
Mm,
Right. And so to go back to your example of like Swedes in the bar, there are maybe, or Scandinavians in the bar, I imagine, I don't quite know the situation you're describing, but I imagine there are certain circumstances in which, I don't know, you talked about your cigarette getting flicked away. Yeah. At one time in a French bar, I got like a cigarette put out quite close to my eye. Yeah. But this was definitely a case of disciplinary power because it was not put out close to my eye in a moment of charisma,
mm,
where let's say some particular kind of like, local vigilante or hero stepped up in a moment of confrontation and said, I'm the most powerful. I'm going to kind of humiliate you, or I'm going to, perform this act of violence on you, and it's me. No, what
mm,
happened was there was a very slow feeling that they wanted, people in the bar were becoming irritated by me. Okay. They wanted to evict me. They wanted to banish me from this night out. And so very slowly, almost like amorphously, without any like leader or like a guide, a sort of mob of boys came over and kind of tried to drift me out at the same time, pushing me little bits here and there. And then one of them just like stuck a cigarette near my eye. You know, so that again seems to conform um, to like the whatever that model of the microphysics of disciplinary power, rather than the model of sovereign power, which might be manifest again, you know, in a moment of charisma, or in a moment of confrontation, or in a moment where like my wordsmithery or sophistry or rhetoric defeats your argument, you know, in a one-on-one contest. That might be the manifestation of sovereign power in our society.
Hmm.
The other one is like, I don't know what happened with this cigarette thing. You know, was there a general feeling like people moving towards you like a kind of sludge, and eventually, you know, this was taken as a kind of like the community's unanimous decision that you needed to be punished, you know, belittled, or what was it like? Why? What happened? Or
How-
what is the incident that Luke's describing?
Hello?
Yeah,
Are you asking me or are you asking Luke?
yeah. I'm asking you. I'm asking you.
Yeah. I have no idea. I mean, this is like fascinating story. I mean, I hope you're not damaged in your eye.
No. He's
Yeah.
underneath, and it went away
Yeah.
shortly afterwards. No, but I mean, like Luke talked about, there was a moment where somebody came up to you in a bar and flicked away your cigarette. Okay, and this was like it's a trivial moment. Did you just say that, Luke?
Yeah, but I think to me it seems like a bad example. I
Okay.
mean, it's interesting in a psychiatric sense, I guess. You know, like who, you know, but it almost seemed to me a bit too, you know, like it wasn't discreet. It was just like a bouncer, you know, you're misbehaving, get out, you know,
Okay. All right.
like such a concrete punishment, you know, someone filled with I don't know,
Well,
whatever.
the
But
bouncer is another Herculean page, you know.
yeah, um, yeah, I don't know about that. But what strikes me is like, yeah, again, the kind of material aspect of this thing, right? Like, because I think that's really somewhere where where maybe things are a bit easier to distinguish. I don't know what you're thinking about that, Luke, or how you see that, but um, yeah, I don't know. Do you understand what I mean?
Well, what? So something in British culture, being northern, um, there's this kind of materialized distinction between methods of like social control, right? So whereas in the south, generally they take this, but you're smoking next to someone, or doing something that displeases you. And in the north, someone would be like, "Oi, mate, will you put that fucking cigarette out?" And it's quite pronounced, but it's a regional difference.
Hmm.
Um, and the I guess, well, I mean, it's interesting. It only comes to me now, but in the north, you just don't really have this kind of, apart from those the pubs in like shows from the 80s where you go in and it's like "Wah, wah, 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 wah." Everyone looks at you like, you know is this character just come in? uh Whereas in Scandinavia, the kind of like capillary micropower thing is constant and ever present.
Hmm.
um to anyone with any sensitivity, that you're doing something wrong pretty quickly in Scandinavia. Whereas in the UK, uh, I guess because of there's a certain cultural reticence. But you might know that you've not been doing something wrong until your mate says to you, "Oh, by the way, you have to kind of do this kind of thing." Whereas the kind of like the way that Scandinavia works seems to fit into a Foucauldian model much more clearly. And then the other thing is that it's not a kind of a concretized regional distinction in Scandinavia. Like that distinction between um, the guy just being like, oh, we don't let you smoke in here anymore, sorry,
Hmm.
and like violently grabbing the cigarette from your hand or whatever. That
No, no, but he was from Jutland, right? So there could actually be made an argument that he was not behaving as someone from the capital. He was a bit uncivilized, maybe. Uh,
yeah, yeah, an uncivilized Jutlander. Um, but nonetheless, I don't know. I just find it interesting because of this way in which if we're to go back to the psychiatrist, the figure of the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is a kind of node or relay for like social normativity. Uh, when you like, that there must be a difference, or it has to be something that is worthwhile exploring, right? Between very normative and normalized societies, like most of the places in Scandinavia, and somewhere like I don't know, the United States or Britain, one of the kind of like Anglo-Saxon countries. The figure function of the psychiatrist must be, and of course, not just for the banal reasons of the materiality of existence, the kind of cultural history and preoccupations and whatever. Um, but also because in each of those spaces, I think fundamentally what I'm trying to evoke is the relationship between psychiatry and normativity, which is really at the heart of what Foucault's talking about in psychiatric power, and it's something that I kind of continuously wrestle with.
mm.
Within the psychiatric process, like to what extent, like to what extent is um, the psychiatrist there to help me or to inculcate me? And then
Well,
if he's going to help me, how is he going to help me? On what grounds? According to who? There's that famous thing in British politics that Tony Benn picked up on, and it wasn't Tony Benn who said it, but it was there are a number of questions you should ask of people that have power. How do you have power? Why do you have it? Who gave it to you? For what purposes do you wield it? And how do we get rid of you? And kind of, I think you can pose that same question to any kind of like psychiatrist and the notion of um, normativity. I mean, this isn't really in the lectures that we're discussing right now, but a lot of previously I was talking about the movement from cure to management, um, and a lot of what I observed in psychiatric hospital was that there was no attempt at cure, like whatsoever.
mm.
There was like zero kind of like therapeutic engagement. The only thing was to render the symptoms, like voices, hallucinations, da 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 da. And that seems to me very parallel or kind of transposable to the imposition of will of the psychiatrist, who is actually merely a relay or node for social normativity in psychiatric power, right? Like fundamentally, the cure would be, let's take a schizophrenic um, who I'm using this very loosely,
Mm.
but take a schizophrenic who like believes that I don't know, like, aliens are like sending in messages and controlling the universe, kind of stereotypical paranoid schizophrenic, right? You know,
Mm.
they have this idea that they're being communicated to. They have a certain sense of like omnipotence and you know, and so the cure would be to alleviate them of these things speaking to them, or maybe to like break the connection, you know, between these things and truth. Whereas actually, you know, what happens now is that they just medicate these people to the point of you know complete numbness, dullness, and amnesia. Um, and it's almost as if these lectures on psychiatric power. It's almost if they represent a certain kind of like dream or aspiration that psychiatry
Mm.
once had, but has now completely abandoned, at least in the British context.
Mm. But then
I
you
mean, I
think,
would.
even in
Yeah.
that, like, you know, application of like pharmaceutical, you know, cure, you still have the central tenets, like in a less glamorous and less beautiful fashion, the central tenets that we find in the two lectures we just read of neutralizing, taming, and containing, like madness as a kind of raw force, you know, something elemental, as something insurrectionary, just without that the drama of confrontation, you know, without the moment where the kind of psychiatrist has to gamble himself or gamble herself in this confrontation with the mad. The, the cure still is, uh, you know, rendering someone docile and submissive. You know, it's still like, you know, it
Mm.
still conforms to that ambition. No.
I mean, I would disagree. I would say, I mean, my like, or just to point to something here. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the like to a great degree dominant paradigm, but I mean, behavioral neuroscience, right, and kind of, and in a sense, an ideology of individualism is they are very coupled together, right? So there is this kind of sense that, I mean, it's a difficult thing. I think it's complex, but like, for example, autism or the idea of savants, you know, or like, or all kinds of, in a sense, neurodivergence, right? Somehow neuroscience and therefore also psychiatry, because psychiatry, neuroscience, or behavioral neuroscience is very coupled to, I think, yeah, psychiatry, at least. Maybe not so much in France. It's becoming increasingly so, but definitely in the US, definitely in the UK, for example, and I think Germany and Scandinavia as well. But you will have different variations. But there, you know, it's like, well, okay, so if we say that the it's all about, you know, like a kind of taking out the hidden potential of the person rather than curing them, you know, they are supposed to become themselves in a certain way, and then drugs can just kind of help them do that, and then therapy or what else can just help them do that. So right, so we have changed the kind of idea of normativity to say, but as long as you can, as long as you're happy and you can live with it, and we can have drugs and therapy and all these things, then we can kind of make it work, and you can continue being productive, and you can continue, you know, um, kind of discovering your potential, you know, or chasing your dreams, or whatever it might be, right? Actually, I think this is a kind of current, a strong current now in psychiatry and in many things, you know, and I think it's interesting because it does contain like the disciplinary power. There is the sovereign power as well, right? In a kind of strange amalgamation. And maybe also another thing, which is just a kind of global control. No one knows what the fuck is going on, actually. I mean, which might be discipline, or I'm not sure it's even discipline because it functions in a different way. Um, but this, I think, now we haven't talked about it, but I think this it's an interesting proposal to think of current psychiatry, because I think in France you have, okay, you have the kind of legacy of institutional like psychiatry, then you have the anti-psychiatry movement, right? So you have this kind of rich uh, movement that is way closer to a kind of idea that therapy will never cure, you know, this kind of therapeutics, or like that analysis, for example, isn't therapy. There isn't a cure in analysis, and there shouldn't be a cure in institutional psychiatry either. It is never about curing, kind of, but it is still not this full anti-psychiatry stance that everything is just social, fuck it all, you know? Does it make sense, or what do you think about this? I mean, it was a lot of things
Yeah, a lot of things. Yeah. I had like one thought, and then it was like you got a golf club. You got another thought like a golf club to knock that one out of my head. You know?
Yeah.
So I did not quite understand your stance on this, like this mixing up of like, behavioral therapy and then individualism. Yeah. So in one
Right,
sense, you were kind of like repeating their kind of like their lingo and lyricism, like, we're going to kind of liberate you back into your own like destiny,
right,
your a life that's could be fulfilling, and wonderful, and in which you can be creative again. I didn't
right.
quite get what your stance on that rhetoric was. Because
No, I
to
mean,
me, what they seem to
ultimately, I
allow
think.
is a kind of like diet individualism, a sort of stunted bonsai individualism that allows you to say, like, it's like going back to that stuff again. Like, allows you to say, yes, that I am me, yeah, but that me has become so small now, you know, that really it's just a cover for your reinitiation back into a system where you're something, minor, insignificant, just like, where you've been stripped of sovereignty, basically. It's like individualism but without sovereignty. That's what I feel
Hmm.
like those forms of cognitive behaviorism, offer. And because why do you turn up at the therapy in the first place? Well, in some way because like you've been banished, excluded, shunned because of your weirdness,
Hmm.
and you've arrived there because you don't fit in. I mean that's kind of like basic stuff, but I like, so
No, no, I think what I was saying was just that I think I was just making there's this great sociologist, he's called Alain Ehrenberg, a French sociologist, but he's written this book called, what the fuck's it called? Mechanics of Passion, I think it's called. And he makes this kind of long argument, or kind of general argument, that okay, but if we look at like behavioral neuroscience, or neuroscience in a broad sense, but like particularly the behavioral side of it, like there is this general tendency that it focuses on the kind of on the individual brain, and how the kind of individual can come to terms in a sense with their own brain, or the anomaly of a certain brain, and it has this tendency to become a kind of individualistic science in a sense, like neuroscience as such. He makes the argument, right? And then it's interesting to think, okay, so if we have a psychiatry that then relies on this kind of neuroscience, what is it that happens, like. And then he makes the point that but we have the kind of autist activist ADHD thing, where all of a sudden, like, people like Oliver Sacks, for example, is like aligns with that kind of stance, and says, I mean, out of his own experience, maybe also, that, like, we should, as neuroscientists, and I'm making the argument that then therefore also as psychiatrists, neurodivergence is something to be celebrated. Like, it basically is about like honing in on this kind of hidden, hidden potential is his term that he uses. Uh, and then he says that this kind of this neuroscience constantly orients you towards discovering this hidden potential, which I think he is very critical of. He's like, this is a fucking illiberal thing, like what is going on here, really?
mm,
Uh, and that's an interesting thing, because I guess psychiatry now has that. It has the kind of disciplinary thing. It has the drugging down thing that Luke talked about as well. I mean, depending a bit on the institution, the country, and these things, it does hold, like, it can hold a bit of the kind of psychoanalytical tradition. It can hold the full drug down, thing. It can hold the kind of more optimizing paradigm, maybe of this kind of the neuroscientific optimization tendency. I don't know. Yeah, yeah, whatever. Yeah.
mm.
I'm just sorry. Just a quick intervention. I'm just wondering because something that was interesting about what you said is, a lot of people wrongly describe Foucault as a postmodernist, and they also wrongly understand what postmodernism is, right? So they think the postmodernism is some kind of theory, whereas actually
Mm.
it's an empirical description. So like if you go into an Indian restaurant, it's fucking postmodern. Like
Mm.
you go into any kind of commercial environment now, it's fucking postmodern. Um, and Foucault is definitely like the absolute opposite of a postmodernist. He's rigorous, he's empirical. He relies on data, on sources, on um, he doesn't give the. Well, I mean, one of the reasons why these lectures took so long to be published was because they had a whole team of people working out where his sources were from. Um, and so it's now fully sourced, fully referenced. He didn't like that for reasons that we don't need to go into. Um, but the kind of I forgot what I was going to say. It's something about that we live in a condition of post-modernity. Um, and yeah, I can't remember. Lost my train of
Mm.
thought.
All right. What was the other thing you said, Jacob? Just after that individualism thing.
Um, I can't remember. I mean, maybe I made a reference to like institutional psychiatry and then anti-psychiatry, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, okay. All right, yeah.
Uh, could have
You
been.
know, because I've just got this thing like playing in the back of my mind I want to introduce somehow. Luke, if you do remember, just butt in, yeah?
Oh no, yeah, no. I've just remembered. So
All right.
something that you'll notice in the first two lectures, but which becomes like a huge theme of Foucault's work is the conditions of possibility for the emergence of a particular thing. And that is the kind of well, it's the kind of Cavell to Wittgenstein. Like if you understand that what Foucault is talking about is kind of ontological level, is it the conditions of possibility? All these questions of empiricism, relationships, this and that, they dissolve. Um, but what conditions the possibility of certain phenomena? We can call them social for now, but I really hate the term because I don't know if you know, but that social is derivative of economy. So you have Manchester liberalism in the 18th century and the kind of like absolutist ideology of that notion of economy is that in and through the kind of divine truth of the price mechanism and personal choice, um, which requires some explanation, but whatever. In and through the kind of divinity of the price mechanism and personal choice, all problems will be resolved. Right now, when those problems aren't resolved or when problems are created, you have this thing called the social. So I hate saying the social. I hate using the term social because it's it's normative and technical use currently is a complete misunderstanding. It's historically inaccurate. To talk about the social is necessarily to buy into a certain kind of economic reading of history. Uh, but to use it just for convenience, um, you know, we live in post modernity. Very much so. All you have to do is go to a shop,
Mm.
and post modernity is what confronts you. You go to a shop, you go to Irma in Denmark or Waitrose in Croydon. Does Croydon have a Waitrose? Belper doesn't.
No, I don't think so.
You go to your local supermarket and there are pomegranates from Peru. Like there are all of these kind of luxurious and exotic things from all over the world, like placed next to each other. I mean, if you're as ignorant as the British people are, it really annoys me whenever I go to a Tesco, right? Because I want a certain kind of basmati rice, but rather than that basmati rice being in the rice section, it's in the world foods section. You know?
Mm.
So it's like the kind of naughty aisle. Like if you go there, you go down the world foods aisle, you're out. Um, yeah. Anyway, sorry, I've you know burned into nonsense. You got
Mm.
something to say, Patrick?
Yeah, but maybe, but what I'm thinking about here is maybe there is like, so you said a couple of things come to mind I want to try and like piece together. One is that what Jakob said earlier, which is that there is no like absolute transition from one epoch or stage of society to another. Like, and I think Luke, like
Mm.
you agree, we've said before, like we're still living in modernism, like, earlier on, like, there are parallels between Foucault's analysis of the psychiatric scene of cure and the school scene of education. So like there are recrudescences of disciplinary power just all over the place. And I was wondering whether like this is kind of why I like to like hook back to the thing that I started with, this absolute separation of the asylum from the rest of the world, from society at large, or any other like external reference point, anything that could stand as like uh, how should I put it, an alternative reality to contest the authority of the psychiatric situation.
Mm.
Now, it seems to me there's almost like a genealogy of like postmodernity, like in that in that there. So in order to have postmodernity, you have to already institute a disciplinary society that marks out a space, okay, that becomes like incubated from reality, such that signs within that space can run amok. That there can be this kind of like space of simulacra. But the space of simulacra can only exist when it's protected by certain disciplinary procedures, like being separated out, being guarded, being surrounded by a wall or whatever it is. And I'm thinking about how this like, I think I can articulate this by looking at the playgrounds in France. Okay. Now it seems to me that every single parent, is both engaged in a kind of disciplinary tactic where they try to ward off like exile or like scorn some kid who embodies like sovereign exuberance, yeah. Usually my kids, yeah. Because there's a natural like barbarism. There's a natural kind of like barbarism and like primal appetite to children. They run about the place. They shout at each other. Like Victor is like a kind of master at it. He's like a sort of little Napoleon in the playground. He's like saying, "Can you do this?" and climbing up to the top of the thing like that, and standing on like like the house that goes up into the air, and there's a little like point up in the air, standing
Mm.
on the point up here, like in sort of perilous situation, that's making like all the parents look at their watches and be like, "Okay, come on, little Jimmy, time to go home now."
Mm.
Please don't see this, like don't
Mm.
see this kind of high wire acrobatics exemplified as a possibility, please, because I
Mm.
don't want you to think of it as a model and icon for future behavior. So there's that disciplinary maneuver of like bad mouthing Victor, or someone similarly kind of like wild and exuberant, saying that's not the right way to be.
Mm.
At the same time, what that allows is each parent to like solipsistically experience their own kid, no, sorry, solipsistically to kind of curate the individualism of their own kid, yeah, to accessorize their kid, to kind of pamper their kid, and to
Mm.
turn their kid within the context of this kind of like segregated zone into the most special, the most precious, the most wonderful of all those kids. But you can only have that realm of like of simulacrum, that realm of, because beyond fantasy, it's like they actually believe it. There's a kind of hallucination there that their kid
Mm.
is really like clever or really daring or really, because they want them to be daring as well.
Mm.
They want it at the level of simulacrum. They want their kid to be daring. So they're like, oh, woo, look at him go down the slide. Ha, ha. It's funny. Take a picture of how like courageous he is, but don't act like that kid up there who's actually courageous.
Mm.
So like there's this kind of complicity between a disciplinary mover of rejection, of banishment, and like walling in my kid, and then this other thing which is like the solipsistic experience of one's kid as a simulacrum of excellence, you know, as however you want to think of excellence. So he's witty, you know. Look how funny he is. He comes up with these really clever remarks. Mummy, you look so silly today. Oh, let's look at how witty he is. You know, like, do you know what I mean? Like they take anything. They don't need much reality in order to convert it into something that displays these remarkable talents. You know, that turns.
How does that you know, and this is for you, Jakob, because yeah, I have no idea about Swedish schooling and a little bit about French schooling, but how does and you know, because before we were talking about the you know the transposability of Foucault's notion of disciplinary power, which he begins to elaborate in these lectures, and the school, and it's actually a funny story that I remember. A bit offhand, but I remember Patrick telling me about his kids, or you know maybe a group of kids, or you know whatever, and they ran up some steps, you know, like to a church or something, you know,
Yeah.
screaming, "Revolution, revolution!" You know, and they got to the top, and then they were like, "Oh, kind of like done now," you know. It's
Yeah.
over.
Well, they ran up the stairs saying "La Révolution, La Révolution," and then they got to the cathedral, realized they were at the wrong place, ran back down the stairs again, shouting "La Révolution." You know? Because it, like, you know, yeah. Go on. Sorry, what did you want to say about that, Luca?
No, it's just it makes me curious, because okay, the history is slightly complicated vis-a-vis Prussia, and but you know the model of education that the world has adopted is very much the British, you know, the British model, which has its roots in industrialization and societies for moral reform and all this kind of stuff. Um, and because of you know, well, I mean, not just because Patrick has the unfortunate career of a teacher, and I wrote my thesis on education, and you know happen to be our Scandinavian in between. But there's something that interests or fascinates me about this transposability that I think will come up over and over again, just because it's something that I've worked on so much. It's something that Patrick works in so much. Um, and I think with you know because compared to Scandinavia, Britain is a very liberal and free country, right? You know, kind of like culturally, and things have changed. You know, you could pick as many examples as you want to contradict this. Um, but at least it used to be, you know, in the last few decades. You know, if you think of like Soho in the 80s or whatever, or you know Manchester in the late 80s or early 90s. You know, the second summer of love. All of these like you know really important kind of cultural moments. Um, and something that does fascinate me is kind of Scandinavian scholastics. You know, let's call it that. Um, because well, I mean, you know, to bring it into the purview of talking about these lectures of Foucault, it would be well if we accept this kind of transposability of the teacher and the psychiatrist, like how you know so that there was a recent story in the news in Britain which was about how many parents at kind of academies and schools and whatever were complaining about the authoritarianism, the kind of rigid rule of discipline. You know, there were stories like a kid who wanted to go to the bathroom, and he wet himself in class and then was mocked and bullied, you know, for the rest of the year because he'd pissed himself because he wasn't allowed to go to the toilet. And that kind of like extreme authoritarianism in Britain at least has this ironic relationship with mischievousness and rebelliousness, a lot of which seems to have been squashed out But I was just wondering about, Scandinavian schools and the kind of, well, to put a point in it, the mechanisms through which um, a certain kind of normativity vis-a-vis the values, virtues, or whatever of that society inculcated.
Mm.
Is it the case of you obey the teacher? I mean, just for example, not to constrain you in any way, but is it you obey the teacher? The teacher is kind of this godlike figure who has this power over you that you must submit to, or for example, is there a more I don't know that because I read a lot about schools not in Sweden or Denmark, but in Finland certainly, and in Norway. And I'm not talking about Steiner schools or anything like that, but where the relationship between, or the relationship of power between the teacher and the student is very different.
Mm. I must say I don't know. I mean, I'll do my best to say something, but I must say it's really it's not my domain in a sense, or it's something I feel I know right now. I feel I don't know so much about, but I mean, obviously before it was a lot more authoritarian, and that's something that I think my maybe the generation of my parents or generation before. I mean, I had a very old, for example, like in my when I went to what's it called, high school, like when you're between uh, what is 16 and
18.
18, yeah. I mean, she was very old school, strict. You could sense that she was from the old guard. Like you had to fucking listen, and she would do all these things that teachers do that was unusual. She would just take notes in a certain way that younger teachers wouldn't do, or she was used to a kind of older style. So we had that, I think, and then we had, of course, these kind of more the teacher as kind of your friend more thing, where it's like, ah, yeah, we can be funny, we can do these things, and we can have a way more lax relationship, even though the teacher is to be respected. And I think mischief as such, I think, in the schools where I went, I mean, it happened, but it was more. I'm not sure it was so much troublemaking, but more like there is a kind of maybe more a psychiatric element here, where you would have like, you were a kind of you were a student with low attention span, sit down, and like these kind of things. I think I felt it was more of these things more than kids like on purpose being kind of disobeying in this rage or whatever. I mean, there was that for sure as well. Uh, but I'm guessing you would have more of that in other cultures, but it did exist. But I think something that strikes me now that I know has been reported, I don't think it's the majority, but like with phones and with kind of a contemporary spirit, that there has been a lot of teachers who are filmed by their students and who also feel a kind of total loss of control in the classroom. And that has been very widely reported in Sweden. And it has been reported in the sense of a kind of, I feel the undertone is always a bit like, yeah, well, there's so many immigrants now here that they kind of control the classrooms, kind of. Or it's not every time like that, but it always does fall into an image of a kind of overloaded school system where with not enough teachers, and the teachers have now lost their authority and they cannot take the phones away, and the kids can kind of film them and do what they want, and then the parents will get super angry at them, at the teachers, and kind of punish them or something like this. um so that's been something that's been reported, but it's not something I must say, I don't know it well, but it's something I know of.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's interesting then is that you say that what you're describing there is more like the outbreak of chaos, like order falling apart at the seams. What's
Mm,
interesting about mischief is that it involves a kind of almost like a calculated test of authority. So
mm,
it's not just complete wildness. It's not. It definitely doesn't take the form of like an outburst of rage. Yeah, really, it's like a controlled effervescence. So like mischief will be one example of mischief will be something like, okay, every time the teacher's back is turned, yeah, you've got to land a little bit of paper on her desk, okay? And the first one to get caught loses, you know? So there's a game, on the one hand, there's a game of taunting and teasing the teacher, like maybe you know that she's noticed, but there's a certain period of time which she'll pretend not to have noticed, for example. And there's also a sort of game of one-upmanship that you play with your classmate. Who out of the both of us is willing to like trespass over the bounds of the normal, you know, further than the other person? Who's willing to go further into this field of disobedience? But it's
Right.
precisely a testing of like those boundaries, or like, you know, a play with the teacher, a game of seduction, rather than just riotousness, just wildness, you know.
I mean, I think for sure. I mean, it's something I recognize, but for sure that is not, that is something that happened. I would think, but the thing is, I don't know how it expresses itself now and how it's different from, like, let's say in England or France. Like it, I mean, I remember that happening, right? But the question is just how is it different between cultures, and how, do you do it in a different way, or I don't know, or is there, because it's not as if it's absent, right? It is, of course, it's there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. From my experience, like with my kids at school, it seems to be like squashed out, stamped out now. That the tiniest little flicker of weirdness is immediately like pathologized. You know,
Hmm.
um, like for example, in 1 week, I got 2 calls from teachers, one from Victor's school, one from Oscar's school. You know, and like it's actually incredibly rich, these two situations, but like they're both really representative of the characters of my 2 kids. So Oscar got in trouble because he'd been selling sweets at extortionate prices, and and like apparently they said as well he'd been insisting on payment, whatever this means. Yeah. Like that I got to tell that story a bit like with more embellishment in a second. And then Victor was got in trouble because he was teaching people how to hold their breath for a long period of time, you know. But like, you know, he's only 7 years old, like.
Mm.
But that's more of he's the kind of got this sort of like devil may care sort of stunt man, you know, uh, kamikaze type attitude towards his own body. You know, he loves like
Mm.
throwing himself off high walls and, you know, turning himself upside down. So the idea of going through this like almost, you know, physical ordeal of trying to hold your breath kind of suits his character. Yeah.
Right.
But what was really revealing about these, you know, these phone calls was, well, what they said, like the tone of voice in which they spoke and so on. So with Oscar, the teacher seemed at once incredibly ashamed that she was making the phone call. Okay. So the first thing that she said was started talking almost irrelevantly about a couple of years ago. Yeah, we allowed some children to sell pain au chocolat in the playground, but never bonbons. You know, as if like that. First of all, that's an irrelevant distinction. Like quite clearly, like it was this ploy to make her seem like, you know, more human, you know, more reasonable and so on. And then, you know, she started to like frame this thing as a moment where Oscar was like demanding payment, blah blah blah. But it actually turned out Oscar was just selling bonbons, you know. And what he was doing, because he's really like crafty and cunning, was like making the person give the money first, you know. Then he would give the bonbon, and then the other person would ask for the money back, and he'd be like, no.
Mm.
So they'd give him like something ridiculous, like €3 for 2 bonbons, you know, thinking they're going to be able to get it back off him. Then they don't, and they go and like probably grafted him to the teacher.
Mm.
But the point is that like there was once upon a time that used to be um like that used to be left to the playground. You know, that was not something that teachers would intervene in. You know, that would stand outside the jurisdiction and surveillance of teachers. Like, and it seemed in one of like, you know, the many blind spots that exist inside secondary schools. In my secondary school had just thousands of blind spots. You could organize fights in certain places, you know,
Right.
and you could at least guarantee that the fight would go on for a certain period of time, or that you'd get fair warning if a teacher was coming around the corner or something. Now in school playgrounds, they've got the teachers doubling up as monitors, you know, as part of a like security surveillance system. They've got the playgrounds organized so that if you stand on a certain height, you have a kind of panoptic vision of everything that's going on around you. You have constant disruptions and interventions by teachers in kind of like non-dangerous situations. Oh, there's a accumulation of a slightly too large crowd over there. So a teacher needs to go in and break it up, you know. So there is literally no blind spot inside the school that I work at now, for example.
Hmm.
And I get the impression that in the school where my kids go to, precisely because they're being disciplined for something that seems to me extremely minor, like unmentionable. But of course, if there are no blind spots, if there are no grey areas, you know, and the teachers do see it, then they have to say that it's not right. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know, there are certain things that you can, there's an art of turning a blind eye. You
Mm.
don't want to keep intervening all the time. You don't want to keep disrupting kids. But if you see something you can't, you're forced to discipline it. Well, now there is no area where they can just get on with their own lives, and
Right.
develop their own like form of community because the teachers have the kind of burden of seeing everything. And I thought like maybe that has to do with this idea of the the sort of like the infrequency of mischief. Uh,
But then the question is, why is that, right? Because it's also, I mean, maybe this is, maybe it's possible to make like a link here, but like it strikes me like a lot of people, for example, like now I know some people who just had like artist studios, you know, and I think there are several examples of this recently, like maybe the last 10 years, where because of the log of underlying logics, you end up then going into spaces that look like completely transparent offices, right? So you're being watched all the time, right?
mm,
In these offices, like when you're actually like a kind of traditional thing with artists that, well, you have your cave, right? That you can kind of close yourself in there and no one knows what you're doing. Whereas
yeah,
now
yeah,
I have so many examples of people who then go to these kind of offices and then they feel that they're being watched all the time. Um,
yeah. That is
and
interesting.
yeah, and the question is it just because mischief has to always be hidden somehow, slightly hidden, partially hidden, and then when you're in this fully transparent thing, you have to kind of be delusional in a sense to commit mischief. Like you have to just kind of ignore a possible punishment somehow, or I don't know, you know. Whereas you know that you're gonna get punished when you do this, right? And that's kind of part of the game that you could be punished. Maybe you can avoid it. Maybe you will be punished, and there's an intrigue in that, right?
Mm.
Like testing, transgressing the limit, testing it, being punished, like doing it again, or not daring to do it again, or yeah, something like this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I do have hopes. I think mischief is one of these like elastic, versatile, and like what they call it, polymorphous forms. It can just
Mm,
keep reinventing itself. But you are right. As soon as it rears its head now, because it's in this visible, transparent space, it's
mm,
immediately classified as something else,
yeah.
either pathologized or entered into a system of like disciplinary punishment and so on. And so there's no like it's true that mischief always was punished in the end, but there was a moment in which mischief could like unfold itself,
Mm,
become something beautiful, so that everyone would like, let's say, I remember in my school once, like there was a mischief would often take the form of a kind of ritualistic punishment of a certain teacher
mm,
in and through some attempt to kind of like ridicule or deride the teacher because they exemplified some vice, usually grumpiness or being a killjoy or being excessive in their punishments. So one time, like people came in at a certain like dead hour of the morning and put like fish in her locker, and just left it there for ages, so eventually it kind of stunk and rotted, and no one could find the key to this locker, and it caused a big
mm,
fiasco at school. And of course, the culprits were untraceable,
right.
because there was a certain kind of like, loyalty surrounding it, and people kept silent and everything. And so, but now it's like, well, if your movements in and from the school are tracked and observed and monitored, then you can't come in at the opportune moment. Okay.
Mm,
If, let's say, all your padlocks have to be registered in advance, then those padlocks can be traced back to the owner.
right.
And so there's never this period of time in which mischief can actually occur, flourish, effloresce, because certain things which seem not related to mischief have actually uh, prevented it from emerging in the first place, like whatever it is. Like my school now only opens at a certain time, so you can't come in like
Mm,
before the teachers. And the
mm,
teachers stand at these kind of like outposts. There's one that stands like in the middle of this lane, one who stands at the front door, one who stands at the main entrance doors, another person who stands by the playground, almost like marshals at a cross-country running race, kind of welcoming the kids into school. So again, you can't go through a back entrance, I don't know, it's very strange because like when I was younger, the school was also a safe zone, away from society in a way. Okay. So you could hang around in areas of the school that seemed much freer than the road that you've just come in off. Right.
Hmm.
And even though, this disciplinary structure of the school was nearby, now I don't know, there's just a complete excision of all those unclassified spaces,
Right.
all those unnameable spaces, they've just like been kind of surgically removed. And people don't know what the consequences of that surgical removal actually are, you know. Uh, one of which is this like reduction of space for play,
Mm.
one form of which is mischief. The other form might be like, let's think about the eradication of thought in the classroom. Similarly, if you think about what's happened to space in the school has happened to time in the classroom. Every moment is full, to bursting. So there's no leisure time inside a classroom. Every moment is like, here's 5 minutes to do this exercise. Here's 2 minutes to do this exercise. Here's 10 minutes to do these three exercises. After
Mm.
that, we've got 5 minute discussion in which the teacher kind of patrols the classroom, kind of like galvanizing the discussions. So there's never a moment of leisurely thinking, of meditation, of daydreaming inside the context of the classroom itself. No wasted time, no
Right.
surplus time. I don't know. Those two things seem to go together to me.
No, I think what Jakob was talking about and what you were talking about, that I'm going to be in this always unfortunate position, not unfortunate, but difficult one where I've read all of the lectures and kind of know the breadth and scope of Foucault's thought, but this notion of like constant surveillance is one of the most like invoked um, pieces of Foucault's literature, right? Which is
Mm.
the panopticon. I mean, you use the word yourself without putting it in that context, and I have my own contribution to this kind of argument on the notion of well, on Foucault's later thought and his relationship with Baudelaire. But what Jakob said, it really about the windowed offices, that were like glass. Um, and in contemporary terms, it really links me to something that's really big in the British media in the British media at the moment, which is called like work maxim. So basically, like work maxim is this thing where you know it's like your boss comes in and you're like, yeah, no, I want it done on Tuesday. Like you kind of like pretend to be working when you're not working, or you're furiously typing, looking like you're working when actually you're like, I don't know, having tech sex with someone or whatever.
Mm.
Um, and it reminded me of something that we'll come to much later. Maybe we'll come to much later, which is an essay by Baudelaire called "Operational Whitewash." Um, and the first paragraph of which I think is worth reading, reciting. Especially given that this period of Patrick, can you help us out a bit with the French verb surveiller?
Yeah.
What does that like literally translate to, and why did they translate it as discipline?
Surveiller. Okay. Okay. Mm.
Yeah, because surveiller et punir is the French title of discipline and punish.
Mm.
It's also very curious the translation of and I fucking hate people who raise translation problems. But Sevier, like Foucault's, his thesis is l'histoire de folie, history of madness, is very simple. Then the next publication is The Order of Things, Les mots et les choses, which, considering how apt words and things is for the book, is like a strange translation. And then Surveiller et punir is translated as discipline and punish.
I suppose it's because, like, I mean, I'll go back to the actual French later, but because, like we've been saying there, to render transparent, to render visible, is already to place within a system of discipline. Is already to kind of like categorize, tame, name. Manage space. But it just makes me think. Like, I'll give you a few examples. So, surveiller, for example, like a surveillance in English. But surveillance in English has more technical terms, like a thing that a security department would do. Yeah. Whereas in French, surveiller means something like overseen, presided over, um, uh, monitored maybe, but stronger than monitored. For example, they have this thing in schools called like devoir surveiller. Like, it means like a certain type of homework that you have to do. Okay. Which the teacher kind of supervises and presides over. Okay. So to survey could be to supervise or invigilate. So if you think about invigilation, what's the point of invigilation? Well, you like make sure that no one's contravening the laws of the exam. No one's breaking the rules, no one's talking, no one's got like cheats written on their hands and so on. So like I guess like to survey in that sense. Also, I wonder. Let me think now. There's this. You think about the art of the survey. What do they call that in French? Mm. Yeah, it's like okay, like so in France, like if you get stopped on the metro, for example, you'll get stopped by the contrôleur. Okay, so like within French vocabulary, there's this strange link between like verbs that mean something like to keep under control, to manage, to discipline, and then verbs which mean something like to investigate. Okay, to like explore, to like turn something inside out. Yeah, and
So
you can
like a survey and
so you can see survey exactly
yeah.
follows the same kind of thing. To survey is to oversee, to preside over, to supervise, to invigilate, but also at the same time to set out, to survey, to categorize. To get the lie of the land, uh, to, to to map out.
Right.
So discipline, in a way, translates some aspect of surveyor helpfully because it makes us see this other side. But I suppose in order to see that, you need to know that it's a translation of surveiller.
Mm.
And then what's the word used for that Foucault uses for discipline then?
No, he doesn't. He doesn't. He uses. Well, I mean, I haven't read Surveiller Punir in French.
Yeah. So
Um,
like
What would
when he says disciplinary
disciplinary power?
society, does he
Yeah.
so société disciplinaire? Is that what he says?
I
No.
don't know. I haven't read it in French.
Yeah.
Let's have one second. Uh, keep talking though, because this is not going to take. It's going to take.
Yeah, I'll just quickly read. Because it's something that we will come to eventually. But it's an essay by Baudrillard called "Operational Whitewash." The uncertainty to which we are subject results paradoxically from an excess of positivity, from an ineluctable drop in the level of negativity. A kind of leukemia has taken hold of our societies, a kind of dissolution of negativity in a perfused euphoria. Neither the French Revolution, nor the philosophy of the Enlightenment, nor critical utopianism has found its fulfillment through the superstition of contradictions. And if the problems they addressed have been solved, this has been achieved by casting off the negative, by disseminating the energies of everything condemned by society within a simulation entirely given over to positivity and factitiousness. by instituting a definitively transparent state of affairs. Ours is rather like the man who has lost his shadow. Either he has become transparent and the light passes right through him, or alternatively, he is lit from all angles, overexposed, and defenseless against all sources of light. We are similarly exposed on all sides to the glare of technology, images, and information. Without any way of refracting their rays, we are doomed in consequence to a whitewashing of all activity, whitewashed social relations, whitewashed body, whitewashed memory, in short, to a complete aseptic whiteness. Violence
Mm.
is whitewashed, history is whitewashed, all as part of a vast enterprise of cosmetic surgery at whose completion will be left nothing for a society for which individuals for whom all violence, all negativity are strictly forbidden. In these circumstances, everything which is unable to relinquish which is unable to relinquish its own identity is inevitably plunged into a realm of radical uncertainty and endless simulation.
Oh,
Well, that's something, isn't it?
I
So
feel it's
yeah,
super. I'm not sure if Byung-Chul Han in this like achievement society, if he fucking stole or just ripped that part, or if he actually quotes it. I can't remember, but he definitely has done one of the two.
Mm.
man, do you know this book? It's called what is it? Transparency of Evil,
Right.
and
Yeah,
it's actually a
I've read it before.
collection. It's a collection of articles that he wrote for Le Monde. You know,
Hmm.
you
Imagine that
read in
was in.
your you read in your Le Monde on Sunday, and you get fucking Baudrillard.
This is
But
mental.
by the way, are we still? It's soon like 10:30 for me here. I mean, it's a bit. Yeah, you're 9:30. But should we wrap up, or are we still like streaming, or what? What's going on
Yeah,
here?
I think Patrick had something to say, and then we can.
Yeah, what was it about? You mean the King Lear thing?
What was it about? All right, well, I think that's.
But I don't know. I feel like I want to say the thing about King Lear, but I don't like. It's going to take me ages to get it out. Like maybe I'll just leave with a kind of like my suspicion. One thing is that where is it? Let's have a look at it here. Okay, all right. So it's on page 21 for me. Yeah, in the middle.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. I feel like it's just that this moment of like disavowal and like weird sort of craftiness on Foucault's part, because there are a series of like sophistic maneuvers which like ring so false
Do you want
and
to
like
read it?
and yeah and a deliberate kind of like fraudulence as well. So I'm just thinking, what the hell is going on here? Like you could almost like have these maneuvers in a manual about how to like deceive people. So one, deposition and therefore the king's fall. But my impression is that it is not the same type of fall as we find in, say, a Shakespearean drama. This is not Richard III threatened with falling under the power of another sovereign. So that seems to be a mistake. Now, if you're going to talk about a king who's interested in the like in stripping himself of sovereignty, in dismantling the paraphernalia, and regalia of his rule, on basically like dethroning himself, like teasing himself by like playing with his own coronation, and playing with the
Mhm.
idea of dethroning himself, you would not be talking about Richard III. You'd be talking about Richard II. So my thought is he's either he's not for some weird reason not mentioning Richard II, or he's got them, or he's made like a deliberate cover up. I don't know. Anyway, that's my first thing. So Richard III has nothing to do with what he's talking about. Then, nor King Lear, stripped of his sovereignty and roaming the world in solitude, poverty, and madness. Secondly, King Lear doesn't roam the world. Like he, in fact, fails to roam the world. Like, he goes out into the wilderness and he experiences with the kind of like devastating, like rawness, his own body. So precisely the thing that he's talking about, like in this, like in the invocation of George III. Anyway, that's not what I'm talking about. In fact, the king's madness, unlike that of King Lear, again condemned to roam the world, fixes him at a precise point, and especially brings him under not another sovereign power. Okay, King Lear is not brought under another sovereign power, but a completely different type of power, which differs term by term, I think, from the power of sovereignty. Now, King Lear is, in fact, again, it's anonymous, nameless, faceless power that is distributed between different persons. Now, King Lear, have you guys read King Lear, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
No,
all right.
recently, yeah.
So at the beginning, there's this moment where he like cuts his kingdom into three, you know, not passing on sovereign power, but effectively destroying sovereign power, because you cannot just like partition and like segment and divide up sovereign power. Then what happens is one of his daughters rejects it, flees, you know, and he divides up that third daughter's kingdom and gives it back to the other two. Now, his two daughters are kind of like treacherous, conniving, crafty, blah, blah, blah. And they share power with their respective partners in marriage. Okay. And they replace King Lear's sovereign power with a kind of bureaucratic power. That's what they do. And Shakespeare studies this both at the level of like statecraft and also at the level of language. So there's a moment like where King Lear is stripped of his whole retinue, all the soldiers that he goes around with. So he wants to stay with one of his daughters, but she says he has to get rid of all of his soldiers, you know. So she kind of literally undoes his kingship, you know. She kind of like symbolically castrates him, takes away his sovereignty. And in and through doing this, she adopts a kind of she expresses her cold-heartedness through a bureaucratic rhetoric. So she says at one point, for example, you know, you should a little disquantity your train. You know, so this kind of like cold, numerical, mathematical language, you know, disquantity, which is like a kind of like beautiful neologism to express like Goneril's kind of cold-heartedness. So for me, it's precisely the dynamic that Foucault is describing. Now, Foucault wants to draw this distinction between roaming the wilderness and being locked in in an asylum. But it seems like that's irrelevant, because why is he interested in someone being locked in an asylum? Well, because the king, King George, is reduced to his mere body. Okay. And he says quite explicitly at one point that he's thought of merely in terms of need and condition. Okay. So his condition of health and his basic set of kind of like bodily needs, organic functional needs, you know. We'll let you go to the toilet, you know, we'll feed you, we'll dress you at night, and so on and so forth. Now, this is what King Lear is about, right? King Lear says, you know, to his daughters, his daughters say, why do you need 100 men? Why do you need 50 men? Why 20? Why 10? Why 5? Why 1? And King Lear says, oh, reason not the need. You know, our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous, meaning that even a beggar, you know, has more than he needs. Okay. Even the tiniest, poorest, most measly thing that a beggar has is superfluous, you know. Allow nature not more than nature needs, and man's life is as cheap as a beast's. Okay. That's like literally his words. So I don't know, it just seems to me odd that Foucault invokes Lear, then dismisses it, and avoids this confrontation with like Shakespeare's like richly poetic examination, exploration of the same themes, you know, the same terrain as Foucault seems to be going over. Now I have like some like speculation as to why he does that, but I don't know. I just thought it was odd. There's another thing where he even like look here. So he then elides the stories of Richard III and King Lear. And from then on, we'll say that like Shakespeare is irrelevant because Shakespeare talks about the transition from sovereign power to another sovereign power. Whereas again, I said that's not right. So he says at the bottom of the next chapter, next paragraph, at the top of the next paragraph, he says, so this is not a case of one sovereign power falling under another sovereign power. Again, as if that like announces the distinctness of his own study, his own enterprise.
Mm.
And like, so I'm wondering here now, what is King Lear? Well, King Lear is like a play in which nature is kind of embraced in all its turbulence, in its chaos, you know, and in its sublimity, in its kind of in the raw, like impoverishing agony of hunger, and in the kind of the jubilance of folly, in the kind of the gnawing sensations of lust, and in the kind of like, you know, whirligig of madness. That's what happens to Lear out in that wilderness. Uh, and so why does Foucault avoid that nature in that form? You know, that's one like analysis. The other thing is that King Lear performs a reversal almost identical to that of George III. So George III tries to recover his sovereignty through inverting it by taking his excrement and hurling it at the doctor in an imitation of the poorest of the poor, you know, according to Foucault. King Lear, but he's both terrified of going mad and deliberately pushes himself towards madness, beyond the brink of madness, you know, as a way of inverting his, like, you know, the sort of like sanity of kingship, let's say, you know, or like the king's embodiment of a kind of like, you know, force of rationality or wisdom or whatever it is. Or just, I don't know, like the king is supposed to bring order, isn't he? He's supposed to bring some kind of like structure, discipline, balance, a center of gravity. So another way of inverting the king's sovereignty is to be mad, you know, is to become a principle of imbalance, of disorder, of an anomaly, you know. And that's what King Lear does. So it would take me much longer to be able to work out a real answer as to why that evasion exists. Like, is it because Foucault is misremembering the text? I mean, is that likely? Isn't he someone that spends 12 hours a day reading? You know, surely he would have gone back over it. I don't know. Like, you know, or is he nervous about something in that text? Oh.
I mean, there is an explanation afterwards, right? I mean, it could just be interesting to read, to continue the reading. I think there is something there where he kind of explains what it is that he sees as what's going on. I mean, I can read it, but he says, well, you finished before he says, so he says something like, but a completely different type of power, which differs term by term, I think, from the power of sovereignty. So he has talked about George III and then King Lear, and he says, it's an anonymous, lameness, faceless power that is distributed between different persons. Above all, it is a power that is expressed through an implacable regulation that is not even formulated, since basically nothing is said. And the text actually says that all the agents of this power remain silent.
Yeah, and I think that power is embodied in Goneril and Regan, the two daughters that Lear has.
Yeah.
And I think
Luke, can
obviously
you...
I don't think they're the same. I don't think Shakespeare is isomorphic with Foucault. I don't think that Shakespeare like forestalls and like, and how should I put it, gets there before Foucault and like, or anything like that. I just think that Shakespeare depicts a moment of emergence of this, you know, the loss of sovereignty and the shift over to a more bureaucratic, you know, kind of disciplinary power that's dispersed between persons, in which, like, Goneril and Regan have no charisma, you know, and they have no interest in forms of ostentation or play. You know, they continually hide behind like what they invoke as norms, you know, that are obviously just alibis for their own like kind of like convenience and stuff, you know. And it's very complicated because the King Lear is an immensely complicated play. I feel like that's not sufficient grounds to dismiss King Lear, like all the stuff that he said.
I think, you know, something that to think about as we read is you know, the kind of um, you know, it's something in a different fashion. Jakob mentioned before is the materiality of these lectures. You know, they were never supposed to be transcribed, although Foucault, of course, knew that they would be. You know, they're part of his corpus in a way that um, there are very few thinkers who you could compare it to. He knew that every single word that he said would be recorded and transcribed. Um, and then there's you know, I hate to be lazy, but the inescapable Frenchness of Foucault, for which he is unapologetic, you know. He uses French sources, he's talking about France, he's the kind of the application of his ideas to other societies is kind of inconsequential to to the work that he does. And English was always, I think, his worst language. I think he's much better in German and in ancient Greek and in Latin than he is in English. Um, which is something that you can see. And then if you combine that with, um, I was reading a passage from Shakespeare the other day, and the kind of verbosity and richness of Shakespeare is like, unparalleled. You can imagine that convergence of circumstances would lead to if you think theatricality, lack of good English, deep rootedness in French culture, you could imagine him having a kind of like lazy engagement with Shakespeare in the way that we might have as English speakers, like a lazy engagement with Proust or Flaubert, you know. Um, I mean,
Or
they're very well translated languages. One thing that makes me hesitant. Um, when you read Flaubert in French and Flaubert in English, the beats, everything, it lands so well. Like, you read the same passage in English, and the poesy and kind of verve and vigor of Flaubert is the same as in French, or Balzac, or whoever. Um, but yeah,
mm.
I mean,
Maybe then
I
I just
think
add that I
I
think
think just to say, we're always going to be in this position of because we're talking about his most famous work, Discipline and Punish, uh, greatest selling academic book of all time, and now we're in lectures from 73, 74. There was a lot before where I just kept thinking his lectures on the abnormal, his lectures on the abnormal, his lectures on the abnormal, which are 75, 76, 74, 75. Society must be defended. So it's like we'll kind of like build up to these things, but I think the way to look at them is when you read like Discipline and Punish. Fucking hell, it's a hard text to understand. But if you read Psychiatric Power and Society Must Be Defended and The Abnormal, Discipline and Punish all of a sudden just makes complete sense. So we're always going to be kind of ahead of ourselves, because like I've read everything, you guys have read certain bits or have certain ideas, and the relevance of his thinking to contemporary life, to existence, to what it means to be a human being is just you know inescapable. And that's before we get to the really sexy bit where Baudrillard kind of flourishes as a thinker in and through this hidden confrontation.
mm.
Um, so I think it's something that
No, we've got that to look forward
as
to.
we go through, we'll resolve.
Mm.
I think that's
Yeah,
a good point of closing, no? It's a little hook for next time.
Yeah,
why not, eh?
Yeah.
see, Jakub was always the first one to call it, mate.
Yeah.
Back in the day, Mick Joyce.
I was thinking though, if we have like 4-hour seminars every week, we're just going to scare off all potential newcomers.
Ah, no, but we've already done that. Don't worry.
There you go. Yeah,
All right,
we should hope
cool
that
guys.
week number 2 will be more succinct.
No,
Right.
inchitification
Yeah.
infects us all. All right, safe.
Oh,
Yeah.
chill out.
All right.
See.